Thank you. Good evening, members of the MAG Human Services Technical Committee. This meeting is now called to order. It is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube as a way for members of the public to participate. Please state your name when making a comment or asking a question, and I will ask that you keep your microphone on mute when you're not speaking. We will now begin the meeting with a roll call of members.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please, when I call your name, if you could unmute, please, and let us know your affiliation. Karen Bishop? Santiago? Thank you. We'll call again for Karen Bishop, please. Karen? Oh, you're muted.
Hi.
Hi, Karen. Welcome to the meeting. Vice Chair Dykstra.
Here, Gilbert.
Thank you. Seth?
Seth is here.
Thank you. Dulce as proxy for Jerry.
Here.
Thank you. Eliana? Julie Bordelon as proxy for Susan Hallett.
City of Phoenix here.
Thank you. Mary Lynn?
Mary Lynn Kasanick, Area Agency on Aging.
Thank you. Lisa Maddox? Chair Penetescu?
Here, City of
Thank
Goodyear.
you. Kira? Thank you. Kira Peters? Oh, there's Kira. Hi, Kira. We will take the wave. Jason Matthews as proxy for Sean Pierce.
Jason Matthews is here.
Thank you. Chris Charlo?
Kristen Charlo, Care 7, City of Tempe.
Thank you. Amber Wakeman? And Christian Zabrowski.
Christian Zabrowski, City of Buckeye.
Thank you. Calling again for Lisa Maddox?
Yes, Lisa Maddox, City of Peoria, here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Is there anyone that I missed? Madam Chair, we have quorum.
Great, thank you. Next on the agenda is the call to the audience. This is an opportunity for the public to comment on items that fall under MAG's jurisdiction but aren't on the agenda, or that are on the agenda for discussion and not for action. Members of the public could submit written comments via the MAG website 2 hours prior to the meeting. And as I understand it, we do not have any written comments for this item. Is that correct, Amy?
Madam Chair, that is correct.
Great, thank you. So item number 3 is the approval of the September 24, 2024 meeting minutes. Does any member of the committee have any questions or corrections to the minutes? Amy, did you get any via email?
Madam Chair, we did not.
Okay, then hearing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved, Melanie Gilbert.
Motion
Julie
from
Bordelon,
Melanie.
I second.
Thank you, Julie. Good to see you. Motion from Melanie, second from Julie from Phoenix. We will now have members take part in the voice vote by turning on your cameras and unmuting your audio. For those who cannot or do not want to turn on their cameras, we will conduct a roll call vote. So members, please leave your cameras on until after the roll call vote. Can I have a voice vote from the members? Those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. Amy, do we need a roll call vote of anyone?
Madam Chair, we do not. Everyone voted and the motion passes.
Great, thank you everyone. So next up is the social services block grant allocation recommendations. During our last meeting, we discussed options to the process for developing the annual allocation recommendations for the social services block grant, and a number of committee members volunteered to meet as a work group and develop the allocation recommendations for this committee's action. The work group met last week. Thanks to those who participated. Melanie Dykstra, Vice Chair to this committee, will now offer the work group's recommendations for your input. Melanie.
Sorry. So as Christina mentioned, and if it gets really disruptive in the environment I'm in, Amy, feel free to say that and mute me and you take over because I'm outside. So as Christina mentioned, we did meet as our group as we had discussed in order to bring forth some recommendations to the committee today. So that's what we're looking for. We actually have two options to bring back to the group that we want your input on, and then we are looking to take a vote. So if you want to go to the next slide. So as we said, this was kind of the timeline for the SSBG, and the whole timeline moves forward after this. Then it moves to another committee and then to DES. Then they get some public input, and then in May, they submit their final allocations. Next slide. So as we said, right now, we are in the middle of our process. We threw it to our work group, and now we're bringing it back to this committee. We need to make a final decision today so we can move forward into the next steps. Next slide. So as we mentioned, these are draft recommendations coming to the Human Services Technical Committee for recommendation to approve. Once we make our motions in action today, then we will move them on to the HSCIC. And then again, it moves to the Management Committee. So there's some different pieces that have to take place. So that's why we need to get ours in today so it can move to the next committee groups. Next slide. So this is really the 4 target group areas that the SSBG funds do support. As you can see, it's adults, families, and children, developmental disabilities, elderly, and persons with disabilities. So we have about 3.6 million, which was the same allocation as we had last year. So in reviewing the information, and I believe all of you got in your packet some of the backup information that we had been provided as a work group that outlined kind of past expenditures, where things had been utilized, and then we took all that into consideration. So we're bringing forth today really 2 options for these allocations. There's an option A and an option B, because we are looking to potentially move some monies from certain line items, either totally outside of a category or staying within the category, but to fund something different. So as you can see, the adults, family, children, in 2025, it was about 2.3. And this allocation, there is the potential that we would move some funding, either option A or B, so that we get a little, it would either stay level funding or it'd get a little bit more funding. Elderly across the board, we're recommending that stays at the level funding amount. And then it's the persons with disabilities that, again, that would either stay level funding, but with a switch in what is being funded within that category, or it would be reduced as a whole. So next slide. So really what the recommendation is, within the persons with disabilities target group, we would delete 7,500 in funding for the rehab instruction services, as well as deleting the 40,000 in funding for supported employment. What we had found through the research and the information provided to us that these funds have not been fully expended the last 2 fiscal years for these services. We felt this might be an opportunity to move these funds into a more targeted area that would give support to some different services, since these have not been utilized. So next slide. So with that, option A is to keep that funding, which equals 47,525. If you add those two, the 40 and the 7 together, we would be deleting it from those 2 services. But we felt as a committee, one of the recommendations we wanted to bring forward was actually to split it, and it stays within the category of the persons with disabilities, but it helps fund some additional services for the adult daycare, adult health care, as well as also funding some additional home care. So the 47,000 staying within the category but just moving to different line items, and we felt these two line items is where the heaviest need is from the information we received that could use that support. So again, funding's within the same target group, but meets a need for some additional respite services and two different line items that could utilize those services. Next slide. Option B, we did hear that there is also a need for some additional housing support. And so the recommendation would be to also potentially consider option B is taking the full 47,000, taking it out of that whole category and moving it to the adults, families, and children's target group with the intent of having it help support more of some of the housing support services. So that would bring that up to a higher total of $130,000 within that category. So again, the funds would move from the prior target group into a whole different target group in order to meet the needs we heard regarding housing support. Next slide. So what we need from this committee is we obviously can answer any questions, give you more information, but we will have to make a decision if we're going with, well, we would like to bring and recommend either you vote on option A or option B in order to us make a decision of where that funding would be allocated for this next fiscal year. And I will then put myself on mute for the moment, and then Christine or some of us can answer questions if there are any for clarification.
Great job, Melanie. Thank you. Are there any questions from the members or additional input?
I do have a question. This is Julie with City of Phoenix. What would the additional housing supports consist of? Do we have any idea?
Madam Chair and members of the committee, Ms. Bordelon, the additional funding would be used by DES. They would contract that out. They have a request for proposals that they issue. So we just recommend the funding at the service level, and then DES gives that out to the agencies. And so they determine very specifically what services within that overall category would be delivered by the agencies. But a description of what the housing support services intent is included in the documentation for this meeting.
Any other questions? Input? Please just unmute yourself and speak up if so, because I can't see the hand raising. I do believe the committee had a slight preference. Melanie, do you want to make a motion for that to get it kicked off?
Sure, if I can unmute myself. Yes, the motion I'd like to make is for the recommendation of the option A in order to keep the funding within the same service line, but split it into different services within there for higher funding level to those groups as noted in option A. And I don't know, Amy, if it's easier to slide back to that slide so that people can have an idea of what I'm saying. So that is my motion.
Is there a second?
Thank you, Madam.
This is Karen. I would second that motion.
Thank you. We have a motion from Vice Chair Dykstra and a second from Karen Bishop. Any discussion? Okay, we'll do a voice vote again by turning on your cameras and unmuting your audio. And if you can't unmute or turn your camera on, we'll conduct a roll call vote after. But members, please leave your cameras on until after that roll call vote. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Say nay.
I'll say nay. I'm not upset or anything, but I think I like the housing option, but I'm a nay.
Okay, thank
I
you.
know I'm
Seth
the
is
only
a
one.
nay. I'm going to abstain from the vote.
Seth,
Amy, do we need to do an,
Christina, can I chime in? I just want to say to Seth, I don't disagree with you just because our need in the West Valley I'm just not sure if it's enough to make the difference that we need.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, Christina, I had mentioned this before the meeting had started. The information that DES sent to MAG included both state planned and locally planned SSBG funding. And I don't know where DES got the number that we had only served 341,000, but for those services, we had served 15,442 individuals. So I don't know where they came up with such a low number. So just for general information.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. And just before we get too far out ahead or behind ourselves, Amy, did
Madam Chair, the vote was, the vote passed and everyone voted. Thank you.
And Christina, if I could just say something, this is Karen as well. I would concur with Lisa in terms of certainly don't want to be insensitive to the need of those who are unsheltered at this particular time. But I do believe with the dollar amount, there is the opportunity for a greater impact for it staying within the same target population in which those funds were originally directed. And I also see it as an avenue to keep individuals with disabilities to remain within their home when I see home care being provided and other support services.
Thank you.
Christina, I'm not sure if others are having trouble hearing you. I'm not able to hear you. Are others having the same difficulty?
Yeah, we can't hear her.
Okay. Christina, is there maybe a different speaker that you can use or microphone? Not able to hear you. Would you want to try calling into the meeting, Madam Chair?
And Amy, I do have to pop off, but Linda Ayers is on
Okay.
my behalf, so you should retain quorum with her attendance. So I'm going to pop off,
Okay.
but thanks all, and I will see you at the next one.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, if you're okay with this, we can go on to the next agenda item, if that's all right. And maybe in the meantime, try dialing in. Tyler, can you please go to the next slide? Thank you very much. So Madam Chair, members of the committee, happy to bring you an update on our Regional Human Services Assessment. I've met with a number of you. Thank you so much for offering your time, your input, your perspective. It's really important to hear from you what your local priorities are as we work to strengthen the regional coordination efforts and make sure that the regional coordination efforts align with your local priorities. We can go to the next slide, please. So if you recall, we have three main goals with this assessment. The first goal is to make sure that we have that alignment. The Human Services Division has been around for almost 50 years now. A lot has changed. MAG has changed, your communities have changed, the region has changed. We just want to make sure that we're in alignment with you because we know that needs and opportunities can change so dynamically, and that having this touch point is very, very helpful to us. So again, thank you for spending your time with us. As we make sure that we have that alignment, we want to be able to re-articulate a renewed mission statement for Regional Human Services Coordination Planning at MAG. And to have that mission, it provides us that North Star and it helps us to know which direction should we all be pulling in and how can we work together in that space. In terms of working together, we want to make sure that we have the right staffing and committee structure. And so as a result of this assessment, we'll be coming back to Regional Council and seeking their approval after we've heard from you and have your recommendation for any changes that we might want to recommend to that staffing and committee structure. So the alignment, the mission, and the structure. Next slide, please. This is the schedule then. Again, many of you have participated in that listening tour. Again, thank you. Those meetings are really just so helpful. We've completed 18 interviews as of today, and we have about another 15 or so that are scheduled or will be imminently scheduled. So there's more. We've reached out to every single one of our local and tribal governments or member agencies of MAG. We've also reached out to a handful of community partners. And if we haven't reached out to you yet and you'd like to be part of this, please reach out, let me know. I'd love to be able to speak with you as well. We have 2 surveys that we have just completed actually, and I'll be sharing those results with you. You'll be the first ones to receive these results, so I'm very eager for any input, any insights that you might have on those. The first survey was with our human services committees and stakeholders. We had 64 responses on that. The second survey was to our management committee, and we had 38 responses. Yes, there are not 38, 38 local and tribal governments. Some of the communities responded more than once, which is great. Well, you know, early and often, that's fine. The more input, the better. We did hear from all but 3 of our member agencies. So really, I'm just thrilled about that response. Then, so up until now, and then the end of December, that's our data collection phase. And so we're collecting that data then through the listening tour, through the 2 surveys. The 2 different surveys provide us that technical perspective, that policy perspective. We'll be looking at all of that, and we'll complete that data collection phase at the end of December. In January, then, we'll be diving into that analysis with you. We have some analysis already, and so we'll be working to fine tune that. And then really from kind of the November to March time period, we'll be taking a look at what have we learned, what have we heard from you as our partners in this space, and what does that mean for how we work together in the future. And then in April through June, we'll be developing that new mission statement, the structure development, and then coming back to you. Our goal is to have this approved by Regional Council in June, which means that we'll be coming to you no later than May and seeking your recommendation and your input for what that final product should look like. You can go to the next slide, please. Listening tour underway, survey just completed, and then very soon we'll be moving into that transit gaps analysis. Next slide, please. So listening. We've been listening intently. As I said, we've completed 18 interviews, and they've yielded a lot of really, really good data. So we do have about 20 more scheduled. We're reaching out to schedule maybe about 14 more, and we hope to finish all of those by the end of December. Next slide, please. So these are just the highlights, very high-level summary highlights of what we've heard so far through the listening tour. Again, a lot of interviews, a lot of really great pieces of feedback. These are just the top brush, kind of almost headlines. Homelessness and housing. I think in every single interview, every single meeting, we've talked about homelessness and housing, particularly housing. That's really very much on people's minds, and it's a critical issue for our region. Local and tribal governments are using are serving in a wide range of roles. When we talk to some local communities, they don't have a human services department, but there might still be human services needs. So then how do we address those? Some communities, of course, have very robust programs, and they're doing a wide array of different services. A lot are in between those two. But with the regional coordination, it needs to address member agencies, local and tribal governments at all sizes, and serving in a variety of different roles. So whatever we're doing really needs to be adaptable. And while we might have some efforts that are very specific, maybe for one kind of need or one kind of community, overall, we need to have a very diverse approach to our work. A lot of people are reporting that they really value MAG. MAGs are particularly in data and in collaboration. And we're thrilled to hear that. We want to make sure that we lean into those roles and that we continue that moving forward, no matter what that structure looks like. We have heard and had a lot of discussions about MAG stepping into some new spaces. So, for example, would it be a benefit to you if we had regional cooperative procurements and pooled funding? And we can take small incremental steps in each of those 2 areas. So, for example, with the cooperative procurement, there are some agencies, some local and tribal governments that already have cooperative language included in their request for proposals and in their contracts. Could we leverage those, and could more communities reduce their administrative burden by being able to leverage those cooperative tools that are already in place? That might be the first step. Another step could be if we talk with all of you and find out, what do you want to procure? What goods and services do you want to procure over the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? And can we issue a regional request for proposals? It might have more consultants responding because there's more opportunity to work with a higher number of different communities. And does it provide kind of that consistency? And again, does it reduce your administrative burden? You don't have to do your own solicitation. We can do it on your behalf. This would not be mandatory. It would be only if you wanted to utilize this tool. And then all the way up to the kind of the highest level is then, could we have regional contracts? So for example, that's happening already at a sub-regional level, like with the outreach services. You have some communities who are pooling their funding and then being able to get some really good economies of scale. And they're able to contract with one nonprofit agency or a collaborative of different outreach teams, but it's one contract and it's pooled funding. We might be able to do that, for example, at a regional level. Again, only for those who want to be involved, but could we collect funding on your behalf with you, and then could we contract out? It helps you as funders because then you have less to do in terms of that administrative burden, and you have that consistency of cost and consistency of service from one community to the next. On the provider side, it could be very beneficial because they have one application and one progress report instead of the 6 or a dozen different ones, because then they wouldn't have to work with every single community individually. So these are just ideas, but it's explorations. It's ways that we might be able to deliver more value to you, which indeed is our ultimate goal. And all of the conversations, no matter kind of what kind of role we're talking about, there's a lot of appetite for taking action. So for example, you'll see that best practice information rate very high in the surveys. But then we're hearing from people, we really like that best practice information, but what are we doing with it? What's different as a result of us receiving that best practice information? People are hungry for action. We want to be able to take action with you. We can go to the next slide, please. So then in looking at the number of respondents and kind of roughly who they are, oops, I'm so sorry, that should have been an updated slide there for you. On the human services side, we had 64 responses, which was fantastic. Roughly, the majority were from local and tribal governments, 10 from nonprofits, a few from foundations. In terms of the roles of the respondents, those are roughly divided in half between staff and then the directors, which is great. So that gives us, again, that policy perspective, that technical perspective. In terms of management committee, we received responses from 29 out of 32 member agencies. And we had 38 responses from those member agencies, and that represents over 96% of our regional population. We can go to the next slide, please. And so in terms of the human services committees and stakeholders, this is who we heard from. And I wanted to bring your attention to this because where you stand depends on where you sit. So for example, if you're serving on a particular committee like the Regional Domestic Violence Council, you might be more likely to rank domestic violence as your highest area of concern. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it's important for us to know and to understand your perspective. So you can see that roughly a third of the respondents were serving with our continuum of care and different related groups, the collaboratives within that. About a quarter were from you. So thank you. You really showed up in force with that survey. And we want to thank you for your time. 14% from our Regional Domestic Violence Council, 9% from Human Services and Community Initiatives. And then over a third, not necessarily serving on a committee, which is great. So we very much want to work with our community partners. And sometimes they serve on committees and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they serve on more than one. And a few of you serve on our other committees as well. And we thank you for giving so much of your time. Next slide, please. So now we jump into the survey results. So you can see the results from our human services committees and stakeholders in blue. The green is from our management committee. And it's interesting to see where those responses really align. Like on this, for example, we asked you, what do you need to most effectively address human services? And it's funding. It's funding, whether you're a city manager or you're a local government staff or you're working for a nonprofit, we all need more funding, particularly with that funding cliff coming up with the COVID funding going away very shortly. But so across the board, a lot of agreement there. Next slide, please. And please slow me down, stop me if you want to dive into any of these results. Otherwise, I'll just keep on moving. When we asked you, what are your top issues? That's where we saw a bit of divergence. And this has been a point of conversation internally at MAG. So if you have any thoughts on this too, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. And so we asked, what are your top human services issues? We've been asking that in the interviews as well. And we also asked that on both surveys. And one point that was really different, that's interesting, is when we're talking with the human services committees and stakeholders, homelessness was of concern, but not as much as some other areas, and not as much as housing. But then on the flip side, with management committee, homelessness was a huge concern, but then not as much for housing. And so at least internally, we're talking about this as if you're working in homelessness, for example, and keep in mind a third of your survey respondents serve on the continuum of care or related groups. And I used to work in homelessness very directly at the direct care level. I knew that my success as a homeless service provider really was relying on having housing options for my clients. And so that could help to explain this a little bit. And then for city managers, housing is definitely a need. But then you're also getting phone calls from your residents, maybe saying, "Hey, I've got this person who looks unhoused in my community. What can we do to help them?" Or you can imagine different variations of that conversation. So we do have some variation here, and we are starting to dive into that a little bit more with the interviews. But the top issues across the board were homelessness, domestic violence, and housing. Not a surprise when we go to the interviews, when we have meetings like this, when we're out in the community, we hear a lot about homelessness, housing, and domestic violence as well. If you can go on to the next slide, please. This is where it gets a little bit different though. When we ask people, what is your number one concern? It was housing, homelessness, domestic violence. But then when we look at what were their top 3 concerns, a little bit of a difference there. And so these aren't percents, these are the number of responses, for each one. And so you can see that mental health rises to the top. So mental health might not be somebody's number 1 concern, but it's in their top 3 pretty well across the board. And we've talked about mental health here as a committee. For example, I think just in our last meeting or the one before that, we're talking about Tempe's great work with addressing mental health as a local government. I know Chandler's been involved in those conversations too, and others are looking at this. So mental health is an issue that is very much on people's minds, maybe not the first, but definitely in the top 3. And it would be a new role for MAG in terms of direct engagement in that space. While we've been addressing domestic violence, there's absolutely a mental health aspect, and we've talked about that to varying levels. Homelessness, people experiencing homelessness, absolutely mental health issue. Sometimes it's something that contributed to them experiencing homelessness. Sometimes they're experiencing mental health issues because they've experienced homelessness. But no matter if it was a before, during, or after, it's still an issue. So if MAG were to engage in this space, we'd really want to work very, very closely with you to figure out what is the role of local and tribal governments in addressing mental health issues, and then what's the regional role? What can we do regionally together? And so really excited to be able to have those conversations with you. Poverty also comes up very close as being a top need among human services committees and stakeholders. Can go to the next slide, please. So we asked the survey respondents, what range of human services activities are you pursuing right now? What are you engaging in? 1, because we want to be able to learn from you and share those best practices. And 2, if you've already got something covered and we don't need to have a regional approach or MAG doesn't need to step in, then that's great. It's important to have that information too. So there's a whole range. I'd call your attention to the research, because I think this is really interesting, particularly given the results on the next slide. So roughly 30%, 25 to 30% of local and tribal governments, nonprofit agencies are engaged in research and have that as something that they're really actively pursuing. But a lot are not. The majority are not necessarily, which I think is interesting. If you go to the next slide, then research pops up pretty high in terms of what you want MAG to be doing. So while local and tribal governments, nonprofit agencies maybe aren't doing a lot of research on their own, that's where they want MAG to step in with the regional efforts. It also speaks to MAG's expertise in data. And so I think that particular result is really helpful. You can see best practices, again, very high. People value that best practice information. The next question then is, to what end? We're sharing this information. How are you going to use it? How can we support you in using it? What can we do regionally together as a result of having that best practice information? Also, that funding pool comes up very high. So number 1 need to address human services is funding, and a role for MAG could be in the area of funding. We facilitate application processes. We've done that for years with agencies that transport older adults and people with disabilities through Section 5310, which is a federal capital assistance award program. Social Services Block Grant, that was something that we just talked about, and we don't allocate that funding directly, but we have a role in it. But having that regional funding pool could really help us to do more in that space. It also kind of helps us to know what not to do. So for example, events, and I love planning events. I love holding conferences and having a couple hundred people come. That's not really where you need MAG to be. That's okay. I'll have events somewhere else. So that to-do list is important. More research, pooled funding. Stop doing lists. Okay, begrudgingly, we'll stop. Maybe we won't completely stop doing events, but that'll be less of an area of focus moving forward. Technical assistance, moderate need, depending on where you are. It's a really good point to that too, around the training and the technical assistance, particularly the technical assistance. We heard from one local government today saying, we know what to do. We don't need to be told how to do it. We need capacity though. We need somebody to come in and we need an extra set of hands. We need somebody else to help us do this work. So that really resonates too. You can go to the next slide, please. So word cloud, we had some open answers where people could just write whatever was on their mind. We asked you when have we been most effective in our work? And we don't ask that so we can pat ourselves on the back and say, yay, good job. We ask that so we can better understand where should we be leaning in the future? You know, so looking forward, where should we be spending our time and our efforts? And it's in housing, it's services, it's homelessness. It's helping you to address those regional issues. And to make sure that it's impactful, to make sure that at the end of our project together, something is different and something is better because of our work together. Next slide, please. We also asked you, bravely, with a bit of hesitation, how effective are we in addressing human services? And this is what we heard, and it's good to hear. So from the Human Services committees and stakeholders, you can see the very effective and effective. Looks like effective was almost half, which is great. Very effective, about 16%. Neutral, which personally I always wonder if neutral is a nice way of saying maybe not good. I don't know, but we don't know, so we don't know how to read that exactly, but a portion were neutral. And then, you know, a couple of people didn't think we're doing a very effective job, and that's good to know. And I'd love to find out more about that so that we can fix it. You know, we can correct it. We can do better in the future. Management committee, a little bit of a different response. Just about 2/3 said effective, which is great. Very effective looks like about 8%. Again, 25% neutral, which is consistent from the other survey. Nobody saying ineffective or very ineffective there. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'd love to open the floor. And if you have any feedback, any thoughts, love to have those. And these are just some questions that might be good prompts for helping to kind of guide that discussion, but would love to hear what's on your mind concerning these results so far. And we will be sure to circle back with you when we've completed all of the interviews, and definitely in our meetings going into early next year, really diving into the analysis with you to make sure that we're hearing what you're saying, we're understanding it, and we're able to move forward in a really positive direction as a result. Mary Lynn, would you like to?
Yeah, the survey was very interesting. I was surprised when we did our needs assessment last year to do our area plan. The top 3 issues were transportation, housing, and food insecurity. So I was surprised that transportation was not listed in any of your topic areas as a high priority. And I don't know.
Mary Lynn.
Well,
Sorry,
I don't know
reason
this
for that?
because we were interviewing, I mean, we were surveying older adults, but that's always their number 1 issue is transportation.
Absolutely, totally agree. We actually didn't list it on the survey, and the reason for that is because we just moved our Human Services transportation team out of Human Services and into transportation. So it completely agree though, and transportation is a need across the board. I've done focus groups, for example, with survivors of domestic violence. When I asked them, what is your biggest need? It was transportation. So we see that all age levels, all parts of the region, absolutely, big need. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Amy?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, this is Christina. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there additional topics or different angles, Seth?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Great presentation. It was a great survey. I think it was really good that you showed the difference between the technical committee and the management committee. I think that's very telling where they voted. And I think what I took away was there's a right now issue with homelessness, and then but the solution is long-term housing. So that's, I think, the dichotomy of the topic, right? So our management committee needs a right now solution, but we know that it's long-term housing. So that's interesting. I don't know, we'll have to discuss what that means moving forward, but I would just also say that mental health is probably the thing that keeps popping up. So it was good that management committee and human services technical committee and we're about on the same page with that. So I think that's promising. I think we've got a lot to learn there. And so those are my 2 takeaways, but thank you. Nice work.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Seth, I was thinking about that too, and I'm curious how much the attention on homelessness has to do with the work that's been done by MAG to date to bring attention to the issue and housing, and it's sort of that learning curve maybe being reflected also. Good observations. Anybody else have any comments or input? No? Okay. Well, then next up, thank you, Amy. Next up, years ago, we used to have an annual retreat with the MAG Human Services and Community Initiatives Committee. And the goal of the retreat was to set the strategic direction for the committees. We're tentatively planning to have a joint retreat with HSCIC on March 18, 2025. So please hold the time on your calendar. Amy is here to facilitate a discussion on what we would like to achieve through the event and what we would find helpful as a part of the agenda. So take it away, Amy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so target audience for this will be these two committees. It'll be yourselves as staff from our local and tribal governments, as well as the council members and the other members of the Human Services and Community Initiatives Committee. And this is part of the Regional Human Services Assessment. The retreat is something that we used to do years ago. It's called in advance because the thought was that we're moving forward, not backwards. We're not retreating, we're advancing. There you go. But the whole idea is to establish that the strategic direction. And if you think of the broad human services assessment, there's three main tracks within that. Think of it in terms of tracks and then trains, right? So every train has its own track. You are on one track with the Human Services and Community Initiatives Committee. Another train, another track is for the Regional Domestic Violence Council. Then the third is for the Continuum of Care. The Continuum of Care is the most structured. They already have their track laid. They know how they're getting to the station. The other two are still kind of figuring it out. We're looking for more of a strategic direction for those three committees. And so we're also undertaking discussions with the Regional Domestic Violence Council in terms of who of their specific stakeholders would they like to talk to help inform this process and to help shape their direction moving forward. We're doing the same with you as the Human Services Technical Committee and then your counterpart at the council member level. So March 18th will be important. It'll be a really good time for us to be able, again, to dive into that data and then start to shape our future together. What are you wanting to do and what is the most effective format? We can think of this a little bit in terms of a blank slate exercise. So if we didn't have these committees, if we didn't have this history together, all that we had were our current priorities and future goals. What's the best way to achieve that? Is it through these committees? Great, we can keep on staffing them. If it's a different structure, we are totally open to that as well. There's work groups, we can have action teams, maybe it's a committee, maybe it's not, but really look forward to having that discussion with you because we want to make sure that we can serve you in the most effective way possible, and your input to help us shape that will be really, really critical. We can go to the next slide, please. Oh, and a point on that day too, right now, we are looking for your input. We will have it in the office at the MAG offices because it's really helpful sometimes just to get together. We can have it just virtual. We've been meeting virtually, particularly since the pandemic. It could be all in person. So if you're participating, you're there in person. So we'd love to get your feedback on that. It's sometimes a little bit harder to have a hybrid event because then people's attention is divided between the room and the screen. And it can have a little bit of a dampening effect on conversation sometimes. So if we're doing it virtual, maybe all virtual or in person, all in person, but it's up to you. We can certainly accommodate hybrid meetings. We do it all the time. As we plan for that, and we do have time to plan, so that doesn't need to be the last conversation about it, but kind of first opportunity to get your thoughts on what activities, what data, if you have any speakers in mind. It could be a speaker to help inform the process. It could be a speaker to help kind of energize the process. It could be a speaker that helps us that helps ground us in the work, like so maybe someone who's received services who can come back and talk about the impact of it. We're happy to look into all of those options. And then is there anything else that we can bring to it? Is there any other work that we could complete? It could be just the work from the Human Services Assessment with the surveys and the interviews. It could be additional work, additional research, like, hey, we'd love to find out, for example, with mental health, what are the best practices in local governments addressing mental health? We can do that research before the event. The earlier we hear about it, the more we can do. So looking for any feedback that you might have. And if you want to help, yay, that would be wonderful. So if anyone wants to jump in and help us out with any of this, it'd be great to work closely with you. At this point, I will stop talking and see what your thoughts are.
Thanks, Amy. And I do want to share that I did participate in a meeting with Amy and the chair of the HSCIC from Tempe, and the interest was our preference would be to do in person. We feel like it's really important, and this is something that our HSTC group has talked about repeatedly, wanting to be more connected with that group. So I think that in person adds additional credibility to that. So is there anyone who has a perspective for why we would want to do hybrid instead of in person? No. All right, general
In-person
support for in person. Awesome. And then on to Amy's questions here. Has anyone seen any models or practices that are good ways to get these groups to a consensus and unearth priority areas with clarity? I'm familiar with a facilitation model that could be helpful that I'm happy to share with you, Amy. Is there a different way you can phrase that question for our group that might be helpful for you?
It looks like Seth unmuted. Seth, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think in person, definitely for sure. This is not a strategic planning process, right? It's more just a discussion, strategic direction is what I'm hearing. So we don't have to success at the end looks like we have a shared direction, but not a set plan. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm clear.
Thank you.
And
Madam
Chair?
Mr.
Oh,
Yep. No, go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
I think I agree also in person. I think that what may be helpful is that if it's possible, having a like a context or a history pre-read for these participants would be helpful. I think it's great to come together, but there's also, for some of us, we've been involved in this for, I don't know, it seems like 10 plus years or so, maybe even longer. And I think that making sure that we're not rehashing some things, I think would be helpful. But I think just some history and some context, I think should help with that. So we're just maximizing our time that is, intentional in that space. So, I kind of think of the Arizona Town Hall model where they do like the big pre-read or a background report or something like that, which is incredibly helpful and literally just gets everyone on the same page. Then we meet and convene. So that's just a thought.
Good suggestion. Anyone else?
If anyone would like to help with planning it, please feel free to reach out. It would be great to work with you on it. Otherwise, we can put together a proposed format and flow for the event and then circle back with you at our next meeting.
Great. Well, thanks, Amy. You've made great progress on the surveys. The survey results is going to be really helpful, I think, in informing the agenda as well. So, as always, good progress and good work.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Did you get what you needed from us? Awesome.
Yes, thank you.
Are there any requests for future agenda items?
Madam Chair,
Mary
Mary
Lynn?
Lynn has the hand raised.
Yes, could we, at some point have, a show and tell from, cities that are working on age-friendly and dementia-friendly cities? And, I know that, I think it's Tempe, Phoenix, Buckeye, and I think more recently Glendale are looking into it. But, we could like have a panel, to talk about, how they're addressing the age-friendly or dementia-friendly cities.
Madam
Thank
Chair,
you.
we would be
That
happy
came up
to.
before. Yeah.
Thank you. And we do have that on our list of topics to bring before the committee. Just there is some time sensitive action that needed to be taken today, but would love to have that at a very soon meeting.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yep. And Christian, did you have your hand up or were you just celebrating with us?
A little bit of both, yes. Sorry, kind of came in late. I wanted to maybe just add one more piece to the last topic, as maybe a possible outcome, and not to add additional meetings for everyone that already is pretty full with their schedules, but maybe just to propose maybe an opportunity as part of the retreat where possibly subcommittees or smaller groups that are either within closer reach or closer demographic to each other to be able to carry after the retreat. So it's not just the retreat one event annually, but there's some kind of continuation of the topic and the support.
Good suggestion. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, then. Does anyone have any brief updates or news to share with the committee? Keeping in mind that if we have questions for one another about them, we should reach out directly after the meeting because we are not allowed to discuss or take action on any comments shared at this time, but would love to hear about new programs or initiatives and the source of funding and any impacts achieved. Anyone?
So for City of Avondale, we do have an update. We are in the process of reviewing 6 opioid grant applications. So that's the update for us here.
Great.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, then, moving right along, I think we're ready to adjourn today's meeting. I do want to thank everyone for attending. The next meeting of the Human Services Technical Committee is scheduled for Thursday, December 12th at 2 p.m. And with no further business for today, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks.